But now I'm going to move on to the core of my speech. What does it mean when we talk about global Korea? What does being a global player actually mean?
In other words, we can't simply return to the strategies of the past. Jobs and industries can move to any country with an internet connection and willing workers. Now, there are some who believe that we must try to turn back the clock on this new world. I disagree. Not only is it impossible to turn back the tide of globalization, but efforts to do so can actually make us worse off. So rather than fear the future, we have to embrace it.
We're living in an unprecedented era of globalization, spurred on by rapid technological advances. Countries are now truly interdependent. Globalization has created shared interests and shared threats that necessitate deeper obligations between states and their citizens. It requires a different type of international politics and a certain type of global leadership. Both Britain and Korea have received many benefits from globalization. Korea has seen a rapid economic growth fueled by an export-orientated economic strategy. The UK has seen globalization drive structural economic changes for us that will support our future economic prospects. Foreign capital in the UK has tackled the lack of long-term investment from weak savings. Foreign talent has filled gaps in skills and management expertise. Foreign products at competitive prices have helped to keep inflation down. But to share in the benefits of globalization, countries also need to share the cost and the responsibility of maintaining those benefits. This requires a concept of national interest that includes responsibility for safeguarding the health of the international system. The international public goods that maintain the benefits of globalization, economic growth, regional stability, international peace and security, environmental health, need to be protected by the international community together. Global players will need to take the lead in these efforts. So with this in mind, I'd argue that a global player and a global Korea needs to include the following three objectives within its foreign policy aims. So firstly, the safeguarding of global security. In an interdependent world, our national prosperity requires stability and security. This includes traditional security threats, such as conflict, terrorism and proliferation. Our security and stability are threatened by health and environmental problems which do not respect. A global player contributes to tackling and minimizing these threats within an international framework. Secondly, as the recent financial crisis has shown, countries must take an international outlook to economic growth and stability, advancing prosperity across borders. Economic growth in other countries matters to the rest of us more than ever before. Instability is contagious. Countries must advance an international prosperity agenda that supports free trade and contributes towards the economic development of other countries. And then finally, a global player needs to uphold and support the international values of human rights, tolerance, and the rule of law. In its treatment of its own citizens and in its engagement around the world, sovereign states have responsibilities that are enshrined by a set of universal values as set out in the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When human rights abuses go unchecked, our security and prosperity suffer as well. The uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa demonstrate the huge consequences of suppressing people's basic and fundamental rights. In Britain, we certainly try to put support for human rights at the centre of our foreign policy. We believe the support is in our own long-term economic interest. Countries prepared to abuse their own people are unlikely to be stable and reliable economic partners. We also need to be accountable to our own population. British citizens now ask hard questions about countries we're trading with. They want to know about health and labour standards, ethics and foreign policy decisions. I'm now going to take each of those three issues in turn and explore what this means in practice for British and Korean foreign policy. So, security on the Korean Peninsula. Firstly, the responsibility to maintain global peace and security. Korea, of course, has a unique perspective. 60 years ago, in the face of aggression from the DPRK, the international community, under the flag of the UN, intervened to protect the Republic of Korea's sovereignty. Britain was the second largest foreign contributor to this international effort to repel the invasion, providing 58,000 troops. Next week, in fact, 100 British veterans of the Korean War and their families will return to the Republic of Korea. These visits are always personal highlights of the year for me. It's very moving to talk with these veterans, reflecting on the sacrifices made 60 years ago. They're returning to see a country that has made massive political and economic progress. As a result of the UN intervention in 1950, the Republic of Korea is now a global economic power with a population that enjoys democratic freedoms and benefits from the rule of law. Members of the international community, including Britain, have an ongoing role in maintaining security on the Korean Peninsula. Britain is a member of the UN Command Military Armistice Commission, monitoring the armistice agreement on the peninsula. Britain is also a strong supporter of the Republic of Korea in the face of continuing aggression from the DPRK. Last year, we strongly condemned the sinking of the Cheonan and sent naval and forensic experts from the British government to the international team investigating the sinking. Now to move outside the peninsula. Despite these difficulties closer to home, the Republic of Korea is becoming an increasingly active player in tackling traditional security threats outside the Korean Peninsula. Britain and Korea have made contributions to the promotion of global peace and security by carrying out operations in parts of the world such as East Timor, Iraq and Somalia. As President Lee said last month, Korean armed forces have taken a leap forward in defending world peace. Britain welcomes Korea's deployment of troops and reconstruction experts to Parwan province in Afghanistan, which is important to the efforts to bring stability there, and we welcome Korea's wider contribution to UN peacekeeping operations globally. Now, as for UN peacekeeping, I'm just trying to see if it's actually legible. Only just. I think the people at the back are going to have a problem with that. It's also not quite in focus, I think. But this map shows where British and Korean troops have been deployed in the UN's name since official UN peacekeeping deployments began. UN peacekeeping continues to evolve both conceptually and operationally to meet new challenges and political realities. Faced with the rising demand for increasingly complex peace operations, the United Nations in the past few years has been overstretched and challenged as never before. The organisation has worked vigorously to strengthen its capacity to manage and sustain field operations, and thus contribute to the most important function of the United Nations, maintaining international peace and security. There are many examples of where international peacekeeping efforts have made a real difference to securing peace and stability and to improving the lives of peoples affected by conflict. It's important that Korea and the UK continue to use their economic and political influence to support the UN in this goal. Britain and Korea have this strong shared history and share important priorities today. That reinforces our duty of responsible sovereignty, including the need to enhance peace and security within the international community. We have a collective responsibility to protect populations from crimes against humanity. As well as maintaining peace and security and stability in a traditional sense, through military interventions and peacekeeping, global players also need to tackle the serious risk of nuclear proliferation. It's crucial that global players uphold and enforce the international non-proliferation regime. The UN Security Council has formally recognised the threat to non-proliferation posed by Iran through its decision last year to impose further sanctions on the country. It's been challenging for Korea to respond to these sanctions, as Iran is a large supplier of oil imports and an export market for Korean goods. But the risks to Korea's energy security would be far greater if Iran were to develop nuclear weapons. A nuclear-armed Iran could induce Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and others to reconsider their decisions not to develop nuclear weapons. If they did so, the breakdown in the non-proliferation regime would hasten. Tensions would rise in the Persian Gulf, putting at risk the entire global energy market. It's very important for Korea to play a strong role in implementing the sanctions regime against Iran and other proliferating states of concern. If we fail to work in concert now, together we will face serious consequences later. Global players must also work together to tackle the shared threat of climate change. Continued global warming is likely to lead to more intense heat waves, droughts, and severe storms in many regions. The social, environmental, and economic costs of climate change could be huge. And climate change is not just a threat in itself. It acts as a multiplier on existing stresses over scarce natural resources. Global food prices are rising, and this could accelerate as climate change affects harvests around the world. Water scarcity will intensify with any rise in temperatures and changes in weather patterns resulting from climate change. The UN estimates almost half the world's population will be living in areas of high water stress by 2030. Rising oil and gas prices would be a huge constraint on stable growth. In Europe, we recognise the threat of climate change from an early stage and took bold action to start the transition towards a low-carbon economy. The EU has committed itself to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by 2020 and by 80% by 2050. In the UK, we've made our low-carbon targets legally binding. London's become the financial centre for the emerging global carbon market. I know President Lee also recognises the scale and urgency of the problem, and I welcome the actions Korea is taking to accelerate the transition to an energy-efficient, low-carbon, high-growth global economy. The world needs clear leadership in climate change, an area where Korea could well play an important role. Korea has a real chance to become a global leader here. Countries do look to Korea as a model for economic growth. If Korea can show that it's possible to grow and be green at the same time, then there's a real possibility, a real opportunity to change the way that people think about economic growth. President Lee is clear that the drivers of future economic growth will be green, low-carbon technology, new and renewable energy, energy-efficient products. You're about to implement some of the hard policies to make the transition to this new green model of growth, notably through an emissions trading scheme. I'm pleased that the UK has been associated with many of the policy developments taking place, and I'm very proud of the strong partnership that my embassy has built with the Korean government on climate change. The Cancun Agreement showed that the international community is serious about tackling climate change, but we will achieve a legally binding global deal only when countries have confidence in the low-carbon economy. That makes Korea's role so important. Your green growth policies could be a model for the world. The world needs Korea to be active internationally, showing the leadership you did at the G20, explaining, exporting, and accelerating green growth. And from my time here in the 1970s, I remember the Semal movement. You took this model to other countries, telling the Semal movement story and encouraging leaders to develop their own programs. I believe Korea can use this sort of approach with low-carbon green growth. You can use the energetic diplomacy we saw at the G20 to tell the green growth story, persuading, building confidence, and encouraging leaders to develop their own green model of growth. Of course, the Semal movement developed over decades. It's still around. We don't have that time. Climate change will not wait. The world needs Korean leadership on green growth right now. The second responsibility of global players was to advance prosperity across national borders, rather than focusing on narrow national economic interests. The Great Depression of the 1930s and the more recent financial crisis showed us that economic stability in one country has knock-on effects globally. It is an open global economy that has driven economic growth and the rise in living standards around the world. A responsible global player is one that works with other countries to keep the forces of protectionism at bay and to dismantle barriers to trade. The UK continues to argue strongly for open trade and investment, and Korea shares that philosophy, that open markets are central to driving global economic growth and poverty reduction. We're both advocates of an early conclusion to the Doha Development Agenda in 2011. This would deliver a boost of £110 billion per year into the global economy, give the poorest people in the world a share of the benefits of globalization, and provide the global economy with a powerful engine for growth. It's important that Korea continues to be a voice in Asia advocating free trade. And I'm delighted to be speaking to you at a time when the EU and Korea have much to celebrate in terms of our commitment to liberalising trade. Britain strongly supports the swift application of the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which will give a major boost to our bilateral trading relationship. It's important for both sides that the FTA is ratified and ready to come into force on 1 July this year. This is the most ambitious trade agreement ever negotiated by the EU and the second largest ever negotiated in the world, removing virtually all tariff and non-tariff barriers. We expect it will be worth up to 19 billion euros to European business and 13 billion euros to Korean business. It sends a powerful message to the rest of the international community that the EU and Korea are defenders of free trade and open markets. Now, as well as supporting international trade and open markets, Korea can also play a role to advance global prosperity through its overseas investments and its overseas development assistance. Korean investment in developing countries can propel those countries to the next stage of development and growth. To make this sustainable, the investment needs to promote better governance, less corruption, and improved accountability. Many developing countries have made their commitments to improve transparency and governance. Their larger trade and investment partners, including Korea, must use their engagement to support these goals. Korea can also play a powerful role as a provider of overseas development assistance. No one can fail to be impressed by Korea's rapid economic rise over the last 60 years, from a low economy country after the Korean War to the 15th largest economy in the world now. Since I arrived in Korea in 1978, I've seen with my own eyes the remarkable growth that has transformed this country, and your chairmanship of the G20 showcased this economic success story to the world. By sharing this experience and using your rising economic wealth to support comprehensive, tailored overseas development programs, Korea can contribute to lifting developing countries out of poverty. This in turn can contribute to a more peaceful and prosperous global society through the boosting of international trade and political stability. Britain welcomes Korea's admission to the OECD Development Assistance Committee, the forum where major donor countries discuss aid effectiveness. It's meaningful that Korea has now ascended to the status of a major donor of overseas development aid. Because of its experience, Korea will know how important it is for donors to focus on aid effectiveness. Effective aid is country-owned, results-focused, and not tied to commercial or political interests. The UK looks forward to taking this discussion forward in the high-level aid effectiveness forum in Busan later this year. The eradication of poverty is a vital international objective for the British government. By 2013, the equivalent of 0.7% of the UK's gross national income will be dedicated to development assistance, increasing from 0.36 in 2007 to 08. Our development programs are resolutely focused on the reduction of poverty in the poorest countries, and we stick firmly to the principle that aid must not be tied. Now, as a country that has transformed from authoritarianism to a stable democracy, and from developing to a developed nation in just a few decades, Korea will recognise more than most the vital place of human rights and democracy in foreign policy. Because of this history, Britain believes that Korea can play a unique role in supporting human rights in its foreign policy. Human rights are now a basic value in our system of international law. It's also clear in our experience that individual rights are a vital component of a stable and sustainable political and economic system. Where human rights abuses are left unchecked, regional and global security often suffers. Britain believes in strengthening the international frameworks and institutions that support human rights, such as the International Criminal Court and tribunals such as that of the former Yugoslavia. Global players need to make the argument to others that their interests, as well as our own, depend on a rules-based international system. We recognise, of course, that countries develop at different paces. Democracy rests on foundations that have to be built over time. Strong institutions, responsible and accountable government, a free press, the rule of law, and equal rights for men and women. Elections alone do not create a free and democratic society. But this does not mean we should sit on our hands or simply resign ourselves to the idea that change in certain countries will not happen for decades. We must work with other countries to build international coalitions that speak out against human rights abuses, using our own conduct to set an example. The European Union raises concerns about human rights wherever and whenever these concerns arise, including with those countries with whom we are seeking closer ties. The EU's enlargement to the south and east in Europe has done much to strengthen democracy and the rule of law across Europe. The enlargement process continues to act as a powerful catalyst for progress in these areas. Using its economic weight and its rising global influence, Korea has the ability to apply pressure on regimes which commit serious human rights abuses in places such as Libya and Burma, as well as, of course, in the DPRK. I've argued today that if you have a big stake in the international system, you need to step up and protect that system. Economic growth in other countries matters to the rest of us more than ever before. Instability is contagious. Health and environmental problems do not respect national barriers, national borders. So a global Korea with a large economic stake in the international system has a responsibility to uphold global security, prosperity and values. President Lee has been clear about this responsibility in his own speeches and his vision for Korea's international relations. Britain warmly supports his vision. So a Korea that steps up to maintain global peace and security, advances prosperity across borders, and upholds the international values of human rights and the rule of law would be a truly global player. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. I'll be very interested to hear your questions. Thank you very much.